Hi, I'm Dennis Cuevas, Director of the CLE program at the DC Bar. We hope you're enjoying this virtual conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This session, Military Voting Rights and Emerging Trends, is eligible for CLE credit in all states that have continuing legal education requirements. An alphanumeric code will be read out loud and displayed sometime during the presentation. Please take the time to write down the code. Within the next 24 hours, those of you who have registered and paid for CLE credit will receive an email with a link where you will then identify the correct code to receive CLE credit. As we enter our busy season with many state CLE deadlines fast approaching, please allow up to 30 days to process your certificate of completion. Also in that same email, there will be an electronic evaluation form. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. We need a number of them back for accreditation purposes, but more importantly, we review them carefully as we always look for ways to improve our classes. If you have any questions about obtaining CLE credit, please send an email to cle@dcbar.org and we will be happy to assist you. If you are watching this pre-recorded program during the live broadcast, please feel free to pose any questions that you have in the chat room, since our presenters will be available at that time to answer any questions. Now, without further delay, let me turn it over to our distinguished speakers.
Well, welcome, and I appreciate you all joining this presentation on military voting rights and some innovations in the field of military voting. Very timely, and I'm very pleased to be here before the DC Bar Conference and joined by Secretary of State of West Virginia, Mac Warner. My name is David Byrne. I'm the Director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program. And I just wanted to welcome you on my behalf into the DC Bar Conference. Just for your benefit, I'll give you some of my background. As the Director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program, we're directly responsible for assisting our military and overseas citizens on behalf of the Secretary of Defense. And so it's a very busy time as we go through the 2020 election cycle. But I'm joined here today by Secretary of State Mac Warner, and I'd like him to say a few words, introduce himself to the viewers.
Thank you, David. And again, it's good to be with you at the DC Bar. My name is Mac Warner. I'm the West Virginia Secretary of State, finishing up my first term in office. My background is military. I went to the United States Military Academy at West Point. I then served 23 years on active duty in assignments all over the globe. Have an international law background. I went to West Virginia University College of Law and then the University of Virginia to get a master's degree in international law. I taught at the Army's JAG School in Charlottesville, and one of my last tours was overseas with as Chief of International Law in Heidelberg, Germany for U.S. Army Europe. That experience has exposed me to a number of voting scenarios around the globe. Following my career in the military, I did serve overseas for 5 years in Afghanistan with the State Department. And again, that gave me a different perspective and different opportunities to either vote or try to vote. And you'll understand as we talk through today's scenarios as to what caused me and has given me such passion to move in the arena of electronic voting, at least for select or small segments of society, namely military and overseas citizens. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, David.
Well, great. Thank you, sir. And thank you for your service. I know you and I have worked together quite some time in the election community and election space, and definitely West Virginia is an innovator in that regard. So we look forward to highlighting much of what West Virginia has been looking at in terms of innovations for military voting. Since this is a DC Bar Conference, and we figure since there's for a legal education credit, we want to make sure we're structuring this so that we do hit on some of the underlying statutes, policies, things that attorneys would like to know more about, some of the policy framework. And I'm going to outline that in terms of the structure of this program to walk through the brief history of military voting. We go all the way back to the Civil War. I will not belabor some of that point, but we will bring you all the way up to major legislative enactments. And then I will provide an overview of the Federal Voting Assistance Program as it's in operation currently, and then highlight some of our challenges, and then turn it over to Secretary Warner to highlight West Virginia as a good case example, some of the challenges he's experienced, and then we will have some closing remarks in terms of past research that the Federal Voting Assistance Program has done, and we'll be able to answer questions throughout and towards the end as well. So with that, what I wanted to do was share my screen, and since I'm somewhat new with Zoom to do this. And there we go. So I mentioned before my background is with the Department of Defense. I am the director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program. But prior to doing that, I've served in the election administration space since 1998. And I was in South Florida during the 2000 election. Was there front and center in terms of military and overseas ballots coming in after the election day and the 10-day postmark rule that I think more and more people are becoming very aware of. So it's I take it very seriously in terms of how we support our military and overseas citizens, the importance of being able to assist them to vote successfully. So I'm going to walk through a couple of things about our overall program operations. But before I do that, one thing, we go out in the field and we train up voting assistance officers. So when we look back at military voting throughout its history, it actually traces its history to the Civil War. And at that time, Lincoln in his reelection in 1864 had very much a focus on, obviously, his reelection. And that was one of the first underpinnings for precursors, if you will, for the Federal Voting Assistance Program. I share that story with our voting assistance officers. We have about 3,500 of them in the field, just to get them familiar with how their historical continuum. From the Civil War, there are a number of legislative changes and enactments that occurred. This was featured, I believe, hopefully in the read-ahead materials, including the Fordham Law Journal, that walk through some of these major statutory changes. One was the 1924 Soldiers Vote Act, which started addressing some of the issues of military franchise. The Federal Voting Assistance Act of 1955, the Overseas Citizens Voting Rights Act of 1975, which really culminated with the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act in 1986. So what you saw was this progression of a focus on military voting, then overseas citizens, and so you had both the military component as a population, the overseas citizen component, and the Uniformed and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act is really the enabling statute for the Federal Voting Assistance Program, and also specifies certain requirements for the states to administer and supporting the military and overseas citizens. So that broad brush, that's where it came about. The Fordham Law Journal does a really good discussion on the evolution of military voting rights and the statutory laws impacting it. And then in 1986, after 1986, the work still wasn't done. And so the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act was passed in 2009, which really has the potential, I think, at least at the federal level, to change things quite drastically. And that's where we are now in terms of what the Federal Voting Assistance Program does and how it operates. So that's what I wanted to showcase for you here. Just to get our kind of wet the whistle, I wanted to show this video about how we do some of our outreach. It's all about information awareness. Since we are within the DoD structure and the Department of Defense, we are not a get out the vote operation. We are all about raising awareness, educating our military members, their families, and overseas citizens on how to navigate the absentee voting process. So I just want to show this outreach video. If this doesn't get you motivated for military voting, I'm not really sure what will.
This is my weapon. There are many like it, but this one is mine. My weapon is my best friend. It is my life. I must master it as I must master my life. My weapon, without me, is useless. Your vote is your greatest weapon. Go to fbap.gov to register to vote and request your absentee ballot.
So that video is near and dear to everyone's heart at FVAP. I'm not sure how Secretary Warner feels about that one, but it was definitely a favorite of ours with the Rifleman's Creed, and then bringing it forward and repurposing that for voting. So a little overview on the Federal Voting Assistance Program. I mentioned on behalf of the Secretary of Defense, we administer the Uniformed Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. Again, it's all about providing awareness and to the resources, educating voters, and we're going to go through some of our research on how we do that. One of the big themes that we really focus in on is that for the military and overseas citizens, it's all about the challenges they have with time, their geographic separation, and how tight that election window is. And so you get into some of these complexities, and this really does provide one of the common themes throughout all of the statutory changes was how do we improve the level of success? And I think that's the real tie-in as we go forward with this continuum where Secretary Warner and his efforts in West Virginia and some of the technology implications will come later. But throughout, you have these issues of federalism as well as the intersection with policy. So current state of the military, more than half the military members requested an absentee ballot in 2018. Less than half of them received it. We actually have seen a general improvement. Now, keep in mind the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act was passed in 2010, and so we've gotten better at measuring exactly how much more effective we are. I think the real big challenge for us is that, or success, I should say, is from 36 to 42%, they actually indicated they received one. So it's getting better, but trust me, there's no stretch of the imagination. No, we know we can do a better job. We want to be able to measure exactly what are the effectiveness of congressional reforms that were put into place in 2009 requiring states to offer an electronic blank ballot delivery mechanism to the military and overseas citizens, and whether that is really driving a level of success. What we also are required to report to Congress is the overall participation and registration rates. Just like members of the general population, you see this peak and valley, ebb and flow between midterm and presidential years, just like the general population. Because the military population is overwhelmingly more male and younger and has a different racial composition, we do control for that when we report our numbers. So we do typically find that the registration number is higher or on par with the general population, I should say. But we have noticed a recent downturn in terms of recent election cycles in the registration rate as well as the participation rate. Our job at the Federal Voting Assistance Program is not to prognosticate on why that is. We don't ask sensitive questions about their voting behavior or what motivates them. It's much more were they aware of their ability to cast their absentee ballot and how to do so? And did they receive the support they need? In terms of that support, DoD offers voting assistance in a number of facets. One is our voting assistance officers down to the unit level, but then also at the installation level, and then also through our website, fvap.gov. When we look at all of those resources taken together, if a service member uses one of those, they are much more likely to return their ballot. This has been a statistical significant finding since 2012. So we've been very pleased with this in terms of really showing exactly how our program has become much more effective. But if in terms of the metric on participation and registration, that's really the balance where we don't see that as a driving metric for our success. Statute, the Uniform and Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act really talks about awareness, and that is the key metric for us to measure our performance. I mentioned some past statutes, 1955, the Soldiers Voting Act, and actually the Federal Voting Assistance Act. They started moving in this direction of standardizing a federal postcard application, or an application that would do two things for our military. It would simultaneously register them to vote and request an absentee ballot. This was one of the big items that first led to a discussion on federalism in terms of establishing minimum eligibility requirements for a federal election versus state and local. This continues to play out in how states administer their elections. And depending on when these applications are received, voters may qualify for a federal ballot only versus a full ballot, depending on state law. So very much front and center, supporting the military goes right into what is the balance between what is the jurisdiction of the federal government to standardize versus what is at the state level. We also offer our federal write-in absentee ballot, which is really traces its history back to submariners who had no other option but to, based on their length at sea, was to cast a federal write-in absentee ballot, send it well in advance of the election. This has been expanded and is available to all military and overseas citizens, that if they go through the basic process of submitting the federal postcard application first, they will qualify for using this backup ballot. If they still receive their official ballot from their election official, they can send that back. The election official will make sure only one is counted. So this is pretty much can be a lifesaver, if you will, especially for It's all about readiness in the military, and if they're forward deployed, being able to submit an application and then turn right around and submit a federal write-in absentee ballot can make all the difference between success or failure when it comes to voting. It's all about information saturation when we execute our activities. This is a training workshop that we conducted in Fort Gordon, Georgia, with all of our voting assistance officers in attendance. We do that throughout the calendar year in support of a federal election cycle. We begin in earnest in January and continue through the summer, training up all the voting assistance officers, making sure that they know all the key reference information, where to find it. They do not have to be subject matter experts. We try to take that burden off their shoulders while they can focus on their core mission. Some of our communication strategies, you can imagine we do a lot of service branding to really showcase how, whether you're in the Navy, the Marine Corps, Coast Guard, these resources are very much available to you. There's always that service level of pride, and so we try to leverage that in terms of motivating them, drawing their initial interest, or at least know where to find some of our materials and make sure they know how to navigate the absentee voting process. A couple other items in terms of just statutory policy issues that come about from time to time. In terms of military voting rights, the use of the federal postcard application to standardize. Residency is one typically left to the states, and this is true. The issue of what determines someone's, or when you become a resident, is really left to the states. For the military, we recognize that once you enter the active duty service, you may have a home of record, and as you change duty stations, your residency may change. For military spouses, in the past, it was very complicated. You could have your active duty sponsor with a residency in Florida. The spouse could be in Michigan. Under the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act that was just amended in 2018, the military spouse now has the ability to choose their residency to align with their military sponsor, regardless of whether they've actually lived in that particular state. So again, that issue of federalism, the granting of additional rights and opportunities for our military and military spouses definitely continues to play in with voting rights itself. In terms of overseas citizens, this is one of the interesting puzzle pieces for being a Department of Defense. We work closely with our State Department colleagues because we know they are the biggest assets and resources dispersed around the globe to support the Americans overseas. These are Americans at large that are not affiliated with DoD. So in the past, we've really had a hard time understanding more about this population, where they're located. We've gotten much better in terms of surveying, coming up with some statistical models on projecting where they are based on other government abstracts. And so that's what we see here in terms of our density of overseas citizens that we also support besides our military. So in its entirety, we support 1.2 million active duty personnel, 700,000 spouse and family members, and then approximately 3.5 million eligible overseas citizens. So that's based on statistical modeling. Our numbers will continue to change over time. But this gives you a sense of our reach and also how we go tactical when we go into an election cycle in terms of traveling both domestically and overseas to train up State Department staff, voting assistance officers worldwide. So key milestones, the benefit of the federal postcard application is not only that it simultaneously registers and requests an absentee ballot, but it does so for every single election in that calendar year. It also allows for the individual to request their ballots electronically so they can request to receive them by email, which eliminates some of the real challenge with postal transit times and just allowing them greater flexibility to return their ballot and ensure that it's timely. One of the biggest reasons ballots are rejected by election officials is because of timeliness. And so we really focus on the need to take action early. And we do that by pushing out our federal postcard application beginning as early as January of even numbered years, supporting all the primaries, and then continuing to saturate our active duty personnel. One of the interesting quirks of our congressional statute is that we are actually required on 90, 60, and 30 days prior to each federal election that we have to email every member of the active duty force. So how that ends up rolling out is that basically on a monthly basis, we are spamming them. And trust me, we do get requests for them to have us remove them from our email distribution, and we just politely tell them, unfortunately, no, it's required by statute, and we put them back in. We also have emphasis weeks, Armed Forces Voters Week, Overseas Citizens Voters Week, tying in with July 4th holiday, Absentee Voting Week. So really, you can see just how we build towards a crescendo in the approach of the general election cycle. We support our local election officials as well as our state election officials, trying to train them up requirements on what is required under federal statute. There's always turnover in election staff, especially those who are focused on really processing absentee ballots. It's amazing how complex this all can be at the local level, and just in terms of the patchwork and understanding all of these federal and state statutes. So we go out in the field, and that's where Secretary Warner, I know you and I have had the pleasure to visit with one another, but also with your colleagues at the National Association of Secretaries of State and National Association of State Election Directors. So it's truly a partnership in terms of how we cover down and support our military and overseas citizens. And then lastly, our cooperative agreement. We know we can't do this alone in terms of best practices, and so that's where we rely heavily on partnerships and hearing directly from election officials as to what they're hearing, what they're experiencing from a voter's perspective, and there's always room for improvement. And to the extent that we can have those discussions and look for the states to be incubators of innovation, we're happy to support that. We just are very mindful at DOD in terms of our role and versus those of state election officials who have the ultimate responsibility for certifying the elections and the integrity of the ballots being cast. So with that, it gives a really just overview of the Federal Voting Assistance Program, where we've been, where we are currently. That's really at the federal level. What I want to do now is stop talking for a bit. I'm going to turn over to Secretary Warner and see if I can pull up his video, and you can just let me know when you want me to play it. But I'm going to turn it over to him to highlight, once I do this here, hang on one second, Secretary. To highlight what's really been going on in West Virginia. I think in recent years, for those unfamiliar, we always recognize that the federal level, the states are the incubators, if you will, of innovation, I think I mentioned. And that's where Secretary Warner has been leading that charge. And I know based on his service to our country and his family that he's been moving in this direction. So I'm going to turn over to you, Mr. Secretary, to highlight what you've been doing in West Virginia in terms of supporting the military and your experiences, and then you let me know when you want me to roll that video.
Okay, thank you, David. I think what I'm going to try to do is put a kind of a bottom line up front so everybody can understand why David was chosen and I was chosen to give you this full spectrum of operations as it comes to voting here in the United States, but particularly as it comes to individuals who are outside the continental United States, deployed military, overseas voters, and so on, say people serving at state departments, students studying abroad, and so on. I'll do it by analogy here initially. I'm the Secretary of State in West Virginia, and we have 55 county clerks. The counties actually run the elections. I'm the chief elections officer, but I don't have a badge. I don't have an enforcement capability where I can go in and direct a county to obey the law. I can advise as to what the law is. And right now, by way of example, there's a lot of talk about drop boxes. The state law in West Virginia doesn't allow drop boxes to be put outside for people to drop off ballots. The state law says a absentee ballot will be delivered to the county clerk or to the county clerk's designee, a person, not a box. We also have you can't harvest the ballots. You can't bring in more than 2 ballots. So that's the reason for delivering it to a person as opposed to a box where somebody could deliver a number of ballots. So, but if a clerk decides to do that, I don't really have the ability to go and stop them from putting a drop box outside if they have COVID-19 concerns. So I advise against it, but I can't go out and take that box out of the ground and tell them they can't do it. Now, I'm explaining that because as we're talking about the federalism, David works in the federal government arena with DOD, and his job is to, as he's described, inform people of their right to vote. And the FVAP program does quite a good job of that. In fact, I was a voting assistance officer myself way back in my lieutenant days a number of years ago. So I understand that role. But the distinction here is he is limited by statute himself. He's limited by funding. He's limited by the mission statement that FFAP has. And you heard him talk about his job is to make soldiers aware. It's not to get out the vote. It's not to get his numbers up. That's not the metric of success for his program, and so on. My background is such that I personally had difficulty voting in a number of deployed locations. I've been in Panama, Haiti, Bosnia, at other times Ukraine, Macedonia, various places, of course, tours in Germany. And each one of those presented its own set of challenges using the postal system to get the ballots in on time, or the application, then get the ballots, vote the ballots, and get it back. Your mind as a soldier is really focused on that mission, getting a whole lot of other things done. Voting is oftentimes a second or third thought or priority. And it's really more something that you might read in the Stars and Stripes or see on the TV, like, oh, yes, there's election. Can I vote? And you want to be able to vote immediately. But if you have to go through the process of applying, getting a ballot, putting it in the mail, waiting for it to come back, those are the hurdles that soldiers face, and why the participation across the military is quite low. My job, I see it as a state official now, chief elections officer for the state, of a state that has a high percentage of people. We lost more people in Vietnam per capita from West Virginia than any other state. It's kind of an indication of the service attitude that the people here in the mountain state have. Serving in the military gives an opportunity to get outside the mountains, see the rest of the world, but there's a patriotic sense. So there's a high degree of patriotism in West Virginia, of people who want to serve, but they also want that opportunity to vote. My 4 children, all 4 of my children, 2 boys, 2 girls, have all served in the military, and one is still in active duty, one is in the reserves currently. Each of them have had difficulties voting in their experiences and in their deployments. Had a son in Afghanistan who was wounded there. He said his toughest day in the military of all of his years was election day in Afghanistan, not our election day, but the election day in Afghanistan, because he was required to basically protect one of the polling locations. They found 5 IEDs on that day, and it gave him a real appreciation for what we often take for granted, and is that opportunity to vote. And that's where the distinction I want to make with David and the FFAP program. His is a job to make people aware of their right to vote. I see my job is giving those soldiers the opportunity to vote. And that's where, as I was in Afghanistan on remote locations where I was physically not able to send and receive mail for lengthy periods of time, I know that sailors under the polar ice cap, he already addressed that to some extent. Mail service doesn't reach them. Sometimes they're under the sea for 6 months or more at a time. So what is the process by which I could, from the hillside of Afghanistan, or a sailor under the polar ice cap, could vote? And that is this right here. It's voting using a mobile device or an electronic voting capability, an iPad, a computer, or whatever. Wherever our military is located, they receive intelligence via electronics, digits. Okay, that's how the military operates today. If we can operate with intelligence digitally, we should be able to send a vote digitally. So that's the premise that I went on as I took on this duty as Secretary of State in West Virginia, to say, let's get a solution to this challenges, these hurdles that voters or the military soldiers have experienced. And so with that, my elections team, I had general counsel with the state law. I had the information technology people put out the request, and through a series of somewhat happenstance, but as well as people on the other side, and the other side being Tusk Philanthropies. There's Bradley Tusk was one of the implementers and major movers and shakers in creating Uber. And they transformed the transportation world using digits, allowing people to call up a taxi basically using a mobile device. So that gave me some comfort. He was looking to take electronic voting mainstream. And so he was willing to fund the pilot project. And then another set of happenstance in 2015, at the South by Southwest conference in Austin, Texas. There was an individual that won the Innovative Technology Award. I think it was a $10,000 award. And this was Nimit Sawhney, who was running he's a vendor that it goes by the name of Votes, V-O-A-T-Z. And with that $10,000, he developed a program whereby you could vote electronically using a mobile device. The three of us came in contact with one another, had a mutual interest, and that is allowing people to vote using a mobile device. And with that, in 2018, we set up a pilot project. I made it available to the county clerks. We had two that took us up on it, so just two clerks in the state of West Virginia, and a total of 13 people voted. Okay, so that's not a whole lot of people. It's probably not going to change the outcome of an election, but it was proving the technology. So just like David talked about, his measure of success was not getting out the vote in large numbers. Same thing with us. We weren't trying to push this across all of the military. It was simply trying to prove, does this technology work? By the general election, 24 of my counties were ready to use it, and we had about 130 people who voted using the electronic application that Votes had. After that happened, and actually during that general election in 2018, there was an attempted hack on the system, and the system caught it. The security protocols were in place, and they caught the attempted hack. There was a federal FBI investigation and so on. So we hope that we sent the message that you don't mess with federal elections, even if you're trying to, say, do an academic exercise or think that you're doing a white hat type operation to expose vulnerabilities and so on. There's a community in the United States that thinks that the only way to vote is using paper, and anything that is not a paper-based ballot, they will object to. And so that is some of the objections that we saw after the 2018 election, was that people were reconstructing this Votes app on their own and then hacking it and then saying that the application was vulnerable. The actual application was not hacked. The no votes were changed. The protocols are in place. It is a very secure system. I have no concerns whatsoever about this system. We did, however, change in this election, this primary election in June that we've just had, and now in the upcoming general election in November, move to Democracy Live. It is a web-based program. The other was an app-based program. Each one of them has their own security mechanisms and protocols. And when I'm buying cars, one year I might buy a Ford, and the next time I decide to buy a car, I might buy a Chevy. It doesn't mean that I didn't like the Ford or don't trust the Ford. It means that I just wanted a different driving experience. And that's what we did when we switched between Votes and Democracy Live. Votes is a app-based program. You download the app on your iPhone. You vote through the app. The app or the vote is stored in a blockchain, and it's unlocked on election day. In the web-based program that Democracy Live uses, and we'll have a video that describes this in a minute, the web-based program secures that vote in the cloud. It's a very secure system, AWS, where Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, and other 300 agencies store their most sensitive data. So I'm very secure with the protocols of the Democracy Live program, just as I was with Votes. We're just having a different experience during this 2020 election. When 2022 comes around, we'll have a decision as to which way we want to go at that point. So with that, what I'd like to do is show the video of the Democracy Live program so that you can fully understand what I mean when I talk about electronic voting.
At the heart of democracy is the right to vote. This election, more people than ever before will be voting via absentee ballots. The West Virginia Secretary of State's office is using a new secure platform called Democracy Live. This is for military, overseas citizens, and voters with disabilities who cannot vote in person, or because of disability cannot vote a secret ballot. That is, they need assistance with voting. Democracy Live is quick and easy. Please follow these instructions carefully to use this 21st century voting tool. First, submit your absentee ballot request form to your county clerk. Once received, The county clerk will send you an email with your unique PIN number and a link. The link will take you to your online ballot. Next, select Continue. You will then enter your name, birth date, email address, and county. Click Continue, and you will be directed to a page to enter your driver's license number, or the last 4 digits of your social security number, and your PIN number. Click Continue. Now you will choose how you wish to return your completed ballot, by online return, mail, fax, or email. Click the option that best suits how you would like to return your ballot. Once you make your selection, you will be able to fill out your ballot. Each office will be listed in bold, with the candidates up for election listed underneath. Simply check the box next to the candidates you wish to vote for each of the positions listed. Carefully read the instructions for the number of candidates you can vote for provided under each office title. If you select more choices than allowed in one category, Democracy Live will notify you of your overvote. Simply deselect an option before continuing. For write-in options, select the checkbox next to the write-in option, and then manually enter your candidate choice. When finished filling out your ballot, select Continue at the bottom of the page to move on to the final step, where you will sign your ballot and review your ballot packet. On the signature page, click on the Click to Sign box and type your full legal name on the line provided. When finished with this step, click Continue. The next page will prompt you to choose the option of whether or not you received any form of assistance in the filling out of your ballot. Then click Continue. Next, you will download or print your ballot return package. In order to submit your ballot return package via
Okay, did the video freeze there or did...
Follow the 3 steps of confirming your ballot package. To return your ballot via fax, download and print your ballot. Then, fax completed ballot package to the number provided. To return your ballot via mail, click Download Return Package and print. Once you have printed off your ballot, you can then return it to your local elections office with the instructions they have provided. Once you have printed off your ballot, press End Session at the bottom of the page to finish. And with that final click of the button, you will have ended your ballot creation session. Congratulations! You have now cast your vote in the West Virginia 2020 primary election.
The people who have used this are thrilled. I had one spouse of an Air Force pilot who said she was able to do this while she was feeding 2 of her young children under the age of 4 at the kitchen counter. And it took much less time than had she gotten in the car, gone down to the local precinct and voted and so forth. We had in the 2018 election people from 30 countries. And remember, I always said there were only about 130 people who cast votes electronically in that election, but from 30 different countries all over the globe, including places like Botswana, Armenia, Uganda, those kinds of places who, if they were relying on the mail, probably wouldn't have been able to cast a vote. And now during the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, a lot of countries across the globe are not able to keep up with the mail delivery and so forth. So that's why I'm very pleased that we already had this in place ready for the 2020 election. The thing that I'd like to mention to everybody is that this program is being it's been accepted here in West Virginia across the board to the extent that even it was extended by our legislature in a unanimous vote just earlier this year to extend it to voters with disabilities. So if you are physically disabled and can't go to the polls or can't vote a secret ballot, then you're now able to vote electronically. So I've never advocated for this to go mainstream. I still advocate people to go vote in person if you can. That's the gold standard. Use the mail if you have to with an absentee ballot if you have COVID-19 concerns. But I visited a quadriplegic, a fellow who's bedridden, 35 years old, who had never been able to vote. He has just enough movement in his arm that he's able to move his mouse, and he will vote in this general election for the first time, a secret ballot on his own from the comfort of his own home. And that was rather heartwarming to see that type of opportunities.
Gracias por acompañarnos esta mañana.
I'm hearing some back talk.
Tiene el gusto de llevar a ustedes el seminario.
Are other people hearing some Spanish being talked?
I'm hearing.
Seminario virtual.
Is that
Engaging children virtual time.
is that the video?
Este evento ha sido posible gracias a la colaboración del British Council y el Programa Nacional de Inglés a nivel federal.
My apologies. That's again where you have you put a Fed in charge, Secretary Warner, of a video. That's what you get. Hang on one second. Let me exit out of my YouTube link.
Secretary Warner, when we're ready, I'd love for you to pick up that story about the quadriplegic, because that was really enlightening. It's something that people normally don't think about, where he can't move at all except for the mouse. So I think that would be a good place to pick up, David, if you think so too.
Yeah, no, anything just that eliminates that disruption. I've torpedoed the YouTube, so that won't happen again.
Okay. I recently was able to visit a quadriplegic who was bedridden. He's 35 years old, was injured in an ATV accident at the age of 18, has never had the ability to move out of his house to go and vote. And so for the first time in this general election, he's going to be able to vote a secret ballot. He has just enough movement in one arm to move a mouse. And so he will be able to vote a secret ballot electronically from the comfort of his own house. And to see the smile on his face, he said it made him feel human again. That's the sort of experience that I think we need to be reaching out to these select groups of individuals, whether it's military, overseas voters, or voters with disabilities, to give them that opportunity, to make them part of the franchise, give them that opportunity to vote in our democracy. Of course, their votes count just as much as anybody else's. Another example was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ghana who had a 3-day trip to go to the embassy to try to mail a letter. So to try to do that for an absentee application, then the ballot and so forth, it was just impractical for her to do so. She was able to vote using her mobile device, and she was the envy of all the other Peace Corps volunteers, people from Florida and other states, and they were amazed, saying, why does West Virginia have this opportunity and we don't? So what we're doing with these pilot programs is we're proving the technology, that it does work, that it is secure. And my challenge is, if you don't think, or if you're opposed to the electronic voting, give me an alternative. Don't just take pot shots at our efforts to try to leverage technology to reach these people. Give me a solution. And the U.S. Postal Service, on its own accord, talked about, I think there's still some 60 countries around the world that are not delivering U.S. postal service, or doesn't have the postal service due to the coronavirus. At one point, as many as 180 of the countries, and there are only about 200 countries in the world, had disruptions of severe enough that it may have impacted the elections. I know that caused quite a bit of concern in a number of circles. So my challenge to Congress, and I have written the congressional leadership of House and Senate, asking them to provide David and the FAB program the funding and the opportunity to explore more electronic voting. I'm not sure he's willing to take that on. He's probably busy enough as it is. But what this brings us back around to is what we're all talking about with the CLE initiative here today, is there are laws that are involved. We were able to work, as you saw in the video, things such as typing in the signature, the electronic signature. Does that meet your state code? You saw that there was a requirement to assert whether you got assistance or not. That's in West Virginia code. It may not be in other states' codes. And that's part of the dilemma that David experienced when he did the pilot program back in 2010, 2012. Is there are 50 states out there, 50 different sets of rules, regulations, timeframes, different primaries, and that sort of thing. Very difficult to manage that from the federal level. So I think we're approaching this correctly, and that is allowing the states as the independent laboratories to come up with our own solutions that meet our own codes. And over time, I think this will grow. I think even in DC, there was an initiative there during the primary when certain people weren't able to get their ballots. There was a look at turning on the electronic voting system. So I think that you're already looking at that appropriately. So just I would caution everybody to make sure that you are doing this consistent with code. Don't do it simply because it sounds good. Make sure, and if the code needs to be changed, get those codes changed on the front end to the specific program that you intend to use to make it work. Otherwise, there are an awful lot of people out there that either don't want to see it, have their vested interest in other voting machines, mechanisms, paper ballots, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of naysayers out there that are looking to take pot shots at you. Get it right the first time and start small before you try to go mainstream. I'll reiterate, I always advocate people to vote in person if possible. It's the gold standard. And by way of example, you saw in the video, the overvotes. An overvote is where, say, a House of Delegates race says vote for two. If you're sitting at home voting an absentee ballot, there's nothing that stops you from putting in, three people, so you try to vote for all three. You've just done an overvote, and none of those votes count. We had over 1,000 overvotes in just one county alone here in West Virginia in the primary because so many people were voting absentee that hadn't voted absentee before. They didn't understand the process. If you're in person using an electronic marking device, it doesn't allow you to do the overvote. The electronic voting that we just showed you doesn't allow an overvote. So we're leveraging technology not only to reach the voters wherever they are across the globe, but it's also using technology to prevent people from creating human errors that discounts the vote. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, David. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it, Mr. Secretary, and I can certainly appreciate your challenge in terms of being that incubator of innovation and the laboratory of experimentation. And I think that's the real challenge in terms of your role as a Secretary of State in terms of certifying the election, especially with the backdrop on cyber and greater cyber awareness since 2016. And you kind of hit it on the head with some of the challenges from a policy standpoint, especially the signature. I did take notice of the authorization that you would have had to have done to recognize the electronic signature component to really enable full electronic return. That's another complexity, one that we've also embraced in terms of what we can do within the department, which is leveraging from, I know you're familiar from our DoD ID card, leveraging the digital signature from that card, that if a state, from our perspective, if a state does authorize electronic return of either an application or a ballot itself, then go ahead and go that step further. Like if the state has already made that active policy choice, then go the step further to recognize the Common Access Card digital signature, because you're getting DoD to help verify and authenticate this is this person, and we've issued this digital certificate. It's very much the same enabling that we were tracking to the Council of State Governments, what they've authorized for property records and uniform electronic transactions. So I'm definitely right there with you. I think other things that we track and have, it's a complex patchwork. So each state is very different. And I think you also hit on the head with the COVID-19 impacts that, from my perspective, about 17 states still require postal return. Our big challenge is how do you net federal, apply a federal approach, a one-size-fits-all approach to an information awareness campaign. We've got so many complexities in terms of deadlines, methods in which you can submit your materials to the states. So there's definitely one where I can recognize the value, but I'm also one where I have to recognize what my marching orders are. And so that's where I stick to my lane, as you can imagine. A couple of things I did want to also, in the Congressional Research Service report that we sent out also to the DC Bar Conference members, it highlighted some of the past research that the Federal Voting Assistance Program has done in this regard, going back to voting over the internet in 2000. So we've been down some of this road before. We're always on standby whenever Congress gives us a new requirement. But I know I was personally involved with some of our research, and I know there's a lot of challenges that come with deploying widespread technology. One of the challenges we did face was how do you certify, well, for us to make sure we were satisfying the security issue, it led us to an issue of centralizing the architecture potentially through the Department of Defense. And to us, that raised a certain policy issue in terms of federalism, at least from a DOD perspective, is that who owns the system, who certifies the election and the integrity of the ballots cast, and then how does that work within our structure of election administration between the federal government and the states, and in particular the executive branch and the states. So those were, we didn't have, it's beyond our pay grade to identify what's the magic solution there. But it was definitely one we identified as, well, this is an interesting puzzle piece, one we had not envisioned in the past. We also ran into some challenges that's been kind of front and center from a technical standpoint, that the difference between a forward operating location, active duty personnel using their personal devices versus DoD issued devices. And then you get into a whole different ball of wax in terms of what's available and permitted for use, and how do you navigate those waters, deploy security patches, and just all of the mechanics. The mechanics of democracy, I think, is what people lose sight of. So I know you've, in terms of trailblazing, I don't know if you have any thoughts in terms of the backdrop of cybersecurity and some of your challenges, that balancing level of access with security and that ongoing engagement in that arena.
Attention, attendees, let me interrupt. This is your CLE code for this program. Please write the code down. It is V as in Victor, R as in Robert, 83. The code for CLE credit is V as in Victor, R as in Robert, 83. V as in Victor, R as in Robert, 83. Thank you.
The question was basically around security, and there are a number of things that DoD obviously is concerned about: people using personal devices in deployed or remote locations. Does that give away people's locations, unit locations, that sort of thing? And that's why I have asked for DoD assistance and federal government assistance, and why I wrote Congress to see if they would provide the funding that it would allow DoD to basically partner with us to accomplish these or overcome these challenges. Another piece of this is simply getting the word to those deployed soldiers wherever they are across the globe. I don't have access to that, whereas DoD does. And so we are chipping away at that. We're working with, of course, FAP provided some assistance. We're working with the National Guard. For any West Virginia National Guard that are deployed, they are being cooperative. I actually had some assistance from the Air Force in the 2018 election. They put out a notice to any West Virginia airmen across the globe that this electronic voting option was available. So we're slowly making progress. There are counties in Utah, Oregon, the city of Denver. There are a number of locations that are also running pilot programs with varying degrees. They've all been successful. To my knowledge, none have been hacked. So from a perspective of the state's security issues, things are going extremely well. But as we interact with the DoD, we do have to be cognizant of those security measures. And we'll see where the future leads us in that regard.
I will say I'd be remiss not to point out, since 2010, while we've got certainly that need to explore options, and I think COVID has exposed some of that, it definitely is one we've been tracking for overseas citizens about third world countries, their lack of confidence in postal systems. But yeah, from our standpoint, we just report the news. But I think going forward, one thing just to remind the viewers is that since 2010, the military postal system, who supports our military in overseas locations, they have averaged 7 days or less from the time that a voted ballot is dropped off at a military post office and returned to that local election official. So important strides have been made. There's always going to be those anomalies. That's on average. There's always going to be those naval ships that have ballots placed on them. They are heading back to port. They get new orders and have to return to sea. Trust me, I've seen those. We work closely with our service voting action officers to help flag anytime a ship is about to leave, that they get their ballots off, get them back into USPS, or that they red flag any ballots or mail that's coming back to make sure that ballots are are being cared for. So there's plenty of the logistics on the DoD side is always going to be there. And I think that's going to be a challenge for both for yourself and for supporting West Virginians, but also for my role DoD. In terms of, I think one of the big items also in terms of just, it's important to note the cybersecurity element, that intersection now that as we go through, and I've seen enough over 24 years of election administration, not only does it move slowly, but it can change very quickly in terms of what's the policy direction. So a lot of times you have this continuum of accessibility and security. And it seems that, I don't know, Mr. Secretary, if you have a thought in terms of, are we more on an accessibility approach based on COVID, or is it more of is security going to still be with us forevermore, or is it just going to have to be finding a balance?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head with finding a balance. Security has always been a part of the issue, and I think we've overplayed the security aspect and not looked at the accessibility. And by way of example, my son was supposed to be in Ranger School right now. Ranger School was a 63-day program, very intensive. People are aware of SEAL training and that sort of thing. There are special schools the military sends operators to, and it takes them out of mainstream. It takes them away from their home, access to a mailbox and so forth. So in Ranger School, there are 3 phases. Between the phases, between swamp and mountain and so on, they may get 8 hours where they get to go back and shove as much food in their mouth as they can, maybe catch some sleep. But that's the time when all of a sudden, if they think about voting, if they have an electronic option, they can actually cast a vote. But you can't, in those 8 hours, send in an application, get your ballot, vote your ballot, and that sort of thing. So those are the people that I'm really wanting to reach with this electronic voting, is those operators that are out there on the fringes of the world. They're focused on mission. And I'm just hoping that at some point during the election process, they think about voting. And if they're aware of the electronic option, they can turn on their phone, download the app, vote it. And just like I said, the wife of the Air Force pilot that said she was able to do it while she was feeding 2 children, that's easy, that's accessible. And that's what I want to shoot for in all these scenarios. So I think we need to get that balance back right, shifting more towards the accessibility. There will always be this Russian meddling and that sort of thing, but that's where I rely on the latest and greatest protocols and the proprietary interest that these people have. Think about this, back to the votes scenario. If you're using an iPhone, the iPhone has its own security measures on its own. Then the app itself has its security protocol. So you're having to break 2 of these if you're trying to actually hack that. Then think about it. In West Virginia alone, the small state of West Virginia, in the 2018 election, we had 998 ballot styles. So I might have one ballot with a number of House of Delegates and so forth, and somebody living across the street in a different district would have a different ballot style because their senatorial district or House of Delegates representatives are different than mine. So a Russian hacker would have to penetrate and know which of those 998 ballot styles applied to that specific soldier, know where that soldier was in the world to hack his system. It's just beyond the realm of reality that somebody's going to go to that level of sophistication to try to hack one vote. That's why I feel very secure in moving towards this electronic option in select scenarios. It's a risk-reward analysis. The reward to give that soldier the right to vote far outweighs the risk that he's actually going to be hacked.
And I appreciate it. There's an avenue to address some of that ballot style complexity as well. That you go back to World War II and the war ballots that we've got archival footage of. It's great to see in terms of soldiers in bunkers and actually voting in a polling station or casting their war ballots. And that's very close as a precursor to that federal write-in absentee ballot, that it basically becomes a universal write-in and a mechanism. And so look forward to our continued work together, Mr. Secretary, in terms of election administration and our partnership. I'm going to give you the last word. I think we're approaching the end here. Any last parting thoughts in terms of our session today and just the way forward?
Well, just that cautionary note again to everybody that's looking at this. The legal profession is such a key element of all of this and getting it right. So my admonition is to start small, pick a select group that otherwise has been either disenfranchised or has had high hurdles of accessibility, and work in that arena. If you're considering this at all, make sure that the legality is right on the front end. Otherwise, it's going to be picked apart, lawsuits, that sort of thing, election challenges. We certainly don't want that. We haven't experienced any of that here in West Virginia. In fact, our successes were such that the legislature was willing to even extend it to those voters with disabilities. So I think that we're approaching this correctly. And the final word is, if somebody is not in favor of the electronic voting, then I challenge you to come up with a solution that does reach those disenfranchised voters, whether it's soldiers, overseas citizens, voters with disability. Find a solution for it. I'm not tied. This isn't something that says I have to use electronic voting, use mobile devices. But I think that the trend of history is using technology to overcome hurdles, the accessibility issue, overcome things such as physical disabilities, remote location challenges. Let's use that technology. Let's not be afraid of it. If we can bank by phone, right now with COVID-19, there's telemedicine. We're shopping by phone, especially the younger demographic. People were raised with these cell phones in their hand. They expect to do so much. They should be able to vote. Let's find a way to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and just want to thank the DC Bar Conference for having us today, and it was our pleasure. Thank you to all.
On behalf of the DC Bar and the 2020 Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on these important topics. As a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email from the CLE staff to submit your codes for credit, as well as to complete the class evaluation. Feel free to send us an email at cle@dcbar.org if you need any help. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you. Hi, I'm Dennis Cuevas, Director of the CLE program at the DC Bar. We hope you're enjoying the virtual conference marking the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. This session, Youth Voting Rights, Election Protection, and the 26th Amendment, is eligible for CLE credit in all states that have continuing legal education requirements. An alphanumeric code will be read out loud and displayed sometime during the presentation. Please take the time to write down the code. Within the next 24 hours, those of you who have registered and paid for CLE credit will receive an email with a link where you will then identify the correct codes to receive credit. As we enter our busy season with many state CLE deadlines fast approaching, please allow up to 30 days to process your certificate of completion. Also, in that same email, there will be an electronic evaluation form. Please take the time to complete the evaluation. We need a number of them back for accreditation purposes, but more importantly, we review them carefully as we always look for ways to improve our classes. If you have any questions about obtaining CLE credit, please send an email to cle@dcbar.org and we will be happy to assist you. If you're watching this pre-recorded program during the live broadcast, please feel free to pose any questions you have in the chat room, since our presenters will be available to answer any questions that you have. Now, without further delay, let me turn it over to our distinguished speakers. Enjoy the program.
This panel will discuss youth voting rights, election protection, and the 26th Amendment. I'm joined today by Yael Bromberg of the Andrew Goodman Foundation and John Powers, my colleague at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. First, we will talk about the 26th Amendment as we approach its 50th anniversary, discuss the key cases and implementing legislation, and explore how the amendment's promise to root out age discrimination in access to the franchise has yet to be fulfilled. We will then discuss exploring organizing and policy solutions in the lead up to the upcoming general election. And I should say, I'm Marcia Johnson-Blanco. I'll be serving as your moderator today, and I co-direct the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. First, introductions. Yael Bloomberg is the Chief Counsel for Voting Rights at the Andrew Goodman Foundation and a principal of Bloomberg Law, LLC. She's a constitutional rights attorney with 20 years of experience in community organizing, advocacy, and campaigns. Formerly, she served as supervising attorney and teaching fellow at Georgetown University Law Center's Civil Rights Clinic and Voting Rights Institute, where she received an LLM in advocacy with distinction. She previously worked in the Washington, D.C. headquarters of Common Cause and clerked for the late Honorable Dickinson Debevoise in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey. Yael is a graduate of Rutgers Law, where she was a Kinoy Stavis Fellow in the Rutgers Constitutional Litigation Clinic, an Ella Baker Fellow with the Center for Constitutional Rights, and received upon graduation the L.I. Jarmel Memorial Award for the greatest interest and proficiency in public interest law. In 2015, she received the Eric Neiser Public Service Alumni Award in recognition of her work in democracy law. Her path-breaking article and legal call to arms, Youth Voting Rights and the Unfulfilled Promise of the 26th Amendment, was recently published in the University of Pennsylvania's Journal of Constitutional Law. Yael is barred in New York, New Jersey, and the District of Columbia. Next, you'll also hear from my colleague, John Powers, who serves as counsel in the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, where he focuses on voting rights litigation and election protection efforts. John joined the Lawyers Committee in September 2015. While at the Lawyers Committee, he has been part of teams litigating challenges to redistricting plans, voter purges, burdensome registration deadlines, and exact match voter registration requirements. Before joining the Lawyers Committee, John worked for 8 years in the voting section at the Department of Justice. Prior to the Shelby County versus Holder decision, he reviewed submissions for preclearance under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. More recently, he was part of litigation teams challenging the Texas voter ID law and the North Carolina omnibus election laws in federal district court. While at the Department of Justice, John also received the Assistant Attorney General's Distinguished Service Award and other awards for his work. He is licensed to practice in Maryland and the District of Columbia. John attended law school at night while working at DOJ and received his JD from the Georgetown University Law Center in 2013. He served as executive articles editor for the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. He has been published in that journal as well as the Georgetown Law Journal and the Harvard Journal on Racial and Ethnic Justice. He's earned his BA in history from Haverford College and attended a Mansfield College at Oxford University for a year. And I really look forward to our discussion with both Yael and John today. And we're going to start with our Constitution and the 26th Amendment. Yael, can you talk a bit about what rights the 26th Amendment confers and why it was deemed necessary?
Sure. So we're in the 49th year, approaching the 50th anniversary, as you said, Marcia, of the 26th Amendment. Nearly 50 years ago, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 and outlawed age discrimination in access to the franchise. It had been proposed to Congress over 150 times over a 30-year period, but ultimately, when it was proposed to Congress, in its last cycle, it became the quickest amendment to be ratified in United States history, rounding the requisite 38 states in less than 100 days. It was supported nearly unanimously, huge cross-partisan support for this amendment based on various factors. One was the recognition that young people assume increased adult responsibilities and therefore should access the franchise accordingly. This meant like getting married and taking on debt, and also, of course, fighting in war was a major one with the Vietnam War. The second was a understanding that young people were leading various movements of the day, and then they should basically be enfranchised themselves, having served during what was then the Second Reconstruction. The third was this acknowledgement that young people are increasingly informed compared to prior generations. And so this was 1970, essentially. Public education had been standardized throughout the 1900s at this point across America. And young people now had access to television screens, so they were getting the news. So I kind of laugh when I think about that because today we all have, our smartphones and, stringless, endless connectivity to information. And so all of these principles really informed the fact that we extended the franchise to young people, along with this idea that young people were critical to the protection of democracy. It wasn't simply that they deserve the franchise, but that they are important for the fundamental exercise of democracy. And President Nixon noted this during his ceremonial certification of the amendment itself, acknowledging the ebbs and flows that the country goes through in terms of high moral purpose and idealism, and the need for young people to really be at the forefront to help to adjust that issue. So the amendment was ratified in 1971, July 1971, and in the first decade following its ratification, there were various challenges that were raised, primarily because now the local campuses, and not the campuses, but the local venues in which campuses were hosted, wanted to challenge the right for college students and actually also military voters to vote from those venues. And this went up to the Supreme Court in 1979. It also went through state high courts and federal courts and appeals courts across the country. There was a very rich jurisprudence in the 1970s that upheld the right for students to vote from their campus domiciles, and that dismantled challenges to young people. For example, their ability to serve as circulators for initiative and referenda, or for various campaigns. So all of these cases essentially upheld the right for young people in order to vote, But since then, there was this silencing in the jurisprudence, which is why I think so many people have forgotten what this amendment even is. You know, we have, as we're celebrating today, we're celebrating the 100th, the centennial of the 19th Amendment. But if you talk to people, you know, I was writing my article, and even the constitutional scholars, they would say, of course, they know the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, 14th, 19th, et cetera. But nobody knew what the 26th Amendment is. And so this is our call, I think, to educate the public, educate ourselves, because as a result of the forgotten promises of the 26th Amendment, those rights have atrophied among young voters, even as they're increasingly interested and engaged in social movements today and in accessing the franchise.
I'm really intrigued that you said, you know, it was an amendment that was proposed for a really long time, but then when it passed and was ratified so quickly. What was the impetus there that made that change happen so quickly in that short period of time in the 70s?
Yeah, it's a good question, because it's not that the amendment didn't get attention before that period. President Eisenhower introduced it within his State of the Union in 1954 even. But I think that that time period of 1969, 1970 was really the tail end of the Second Reconstruction. And so young people sought to manifest the promises of Brown v. Board of Education after 1954, really frustrated with the fact that those promises hadn't really been upheld. And so in 1960, now I'm forgetting, I think it was four young African-American freshmen from A&T University and HBCU in North Carolina came together, and they basically, they had study groups, and they said, how are we going to manifest these ideas and overturn Jim Crow? And they were the first ones to take to the lunch counter sit-ins in February 1960. That model spread across the South, the desegregation sit-ins, and manifested in a national gathering of young people in April of 1960, which created the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee. And so throughout the 60s, young people were really at the helm and at the forefront of various social movements of the day. And I think that what we saw was, of course, the assassination of Andy Goodman, the name of my organization that we work in his honor to uphold youth voices and youth votes in our democracy. And also the attacks on John Lewis, who was then the president of SNCC, as he was crossing the bridge in Selma. And so young people were always at the forefront, the feminist movements, all of these movements. And I think that at the end, after, the final passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the final passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Housing Rights Act, that there was this recognition that young people had to enfranchise themselves as well. And all of a sudden, I think just a tipping point was reached, because that matrix, that foundation of student organizing had already been established throughout the 1960s. And now they were also going to war and dying in seemingly endless war. And they said, how is it that we've been at the forefront and we ourselves, that we're dying for this country, and we ourselves are not enfranchised? And so that really ticked off how it really spread like rapid fire, essentially across the country on campuses. I think in only 6 weeks, it spread to, colleges, campuses, high schools across the country, and eventually culminated in young people, an organization called the Youth Franchise Coalition that worked with many of the legacy organizations still around today, Common Cause, NAACP, YMCAs, et cetera. And they created a lobbying campaign that was very focused in DC. And all of a sudden, once you had that organizing outside of the halls of Congress, is when you really started to see the traction.
Okay, no, and that's great. And, you mentioned that, there was so much litigation that came about after the ratification of the 26th Amendment. And then there was this silence. And so now, can you talk about the relevance of the 26th amendment to today and the challenges that young people are facing?
Yeah, we have our work cut out for us. Young people's rights to vote from their campus addresses, even just to register to vote, is being challenged. Young people's access to the polling place is being challenged. I did a survey of 60 colleges. About 50% of them had on-campus polling places on election day. I'm currently litigating a lawsuit on behalf of students and the university president in Dutchess County, in a typically blue state. And even there, 70% of the voters that are assigned to the polling location are coming from the barred campus, but have to travel. And I think that that's a story that actually we see across the country, but because we don't study this, because we've forgotten what the 26th Amendment is, we don't have this narrative that's been formed to study this issue the same way that we have some of the other suspect classifications that we really examine in constitutional law. And so it's a really awesome opportunity for us to expand and to understand these obstacles within a lens of the 26th Amendment. So other issues, I discussed this domicile residency issue in terms of voter registration. That is even more relevant today in light of COVID. What happens when students are going to be shifted? They're coming to campus or they arrive to campus after the advanced voter registration cutoff, et cetera. And there's endless lawsuits and challenges around the young people establishing their rights to vote from campus, even though that principle was established in 1979. So where there's this kind of drumming up of principles that have already been won. Additionally, with voting by mail, there's studies that show that of all other classifications and cohorts, that young people's vote by mail ballots are rejected at disproportionate rates. So there was a 2018 study out of Florida that looked at the rejection rates of VBMs, vote by mail ballots, and it found that for young voters, their ballots were rejected 8 times higher than voters 65 plus, and 5 times higher those within the 45 plus category. And we're just not studying this. I think these numbers are very startling, but it's just because we've lost this narrative to an opportunity to really study this area of law. The other issue is with regard to in-person voting, as I noted, access to polling places, but also student identification laws. There's, we have a string of states that require strict voter identification, but the areas in which student ID laws plays here is particularly relevant. Some states don't allow student IDs at all in order to vote, to prove your identification at the polls. Some states only allow you if you have a public school ID, but not a private school ID. For example, Tennessee and Texas allow you to vote with a handgun license, but not a student voter identification card. In Tennessee, you can vote with a faculty ID issued from the same institution, but not a student ID issued from that institution. And even when public school IDs are accepted, there are additional issues there. Like in Wisconsin, they allow for public school IDs, but those IDs, in order to serve as a valid form of voter identification, have to have been issued within 2 years. Otherwise, they're just not accepted. And we know that, that's good for the technical schools that are 2-year institutions, but, for the 4-year institutions, that just doesn't work. So those are issues with regard to student identification. Then the gerrymandering questions also pop up. One of the red flags that I find is when students have to be sent to vote at different polling locations. That's a red flag, but we have to study this area more. And I'm particularly interested in how this overlays with racial impact, especially around the HBCUs. There's a lawsuit that LDF is litigating right now on behalf of an HBCU, a historically significant HBCU in Texas, A&M University. And there it's about equal access to early voting opportunities and polling locations. And there you have a situation where the county itself is essentially white, and you have a group of voters that historically has been disenfranchised. And these raise very interesting questions from a constitutional analysis perspective of not just, discrimination on account of age, but discrimination on account of race and discrimination on account of both age and race. So two suspect classifications, and how do you treat that? And the standard of review in this current jurisprudence is still evolving. I offer a standard of review in my legal scholarship. This is very much something that the courts are still struggling with. And so it's really incumbent on us as the public interest bar, and the bar interested in voting rights, to kind of anticipate that and grapple with the questions that are being presented. And the last piece, I mean, I can talk endlessly about this, but the last piece that people always find surprising is also, I talked about the disproportionate rejection of vote by mail ballots by this age cohort, but the over-reliance and the disproportional rejections of provisional ballots is also a real issue for this age cohort. So provisional ballots are the last stopgap, right? Every single method in terms of getting you to the polls failed, and you show up on election day, you're not on the rolls, and you're being offered a provisional ballot. Well, for millennials, 1 in 4 have to vote provisionally. And what does that mean? Because we don't look at the potential rejections of those provisional ballots based on age too. So 1 in 4 are being offered a provisional ballot. In some cases, those provisional ballots will not be counted, because in about half the states, if you cast a provisional ballot in the wrong jurisdiction, it'll just be canceled out. Even the partial ballot that you are eligible to vote for will just be tossed. So we really need to fix that issue. But so 1 in 4 vote provisionally, and then about 6% of baby boomers vote provisionally, and 2 or 3% of the greatest generation. So over-reliance on provisional ballots and disproportionate rejection of them. A district court in Florida, we brought a lawsuit challenging a statewide ban of situating polling places on college campuses in Florida during the early voting period, premised on the 26th Amendment. And the judge looked at the rejection rates of the provisional ballots and found that 1 in 4 of the provisional ballots, that young people's provisional ballots were being rejected 4 times more than other voters. So over-reliance and over-rejection. And so where does this leave us? It's just a rich area of study, analysis, and a forgotten jurisprudence that we really need to kind of continue to examine and flex that muscle so that we understand and can identify where a 26th Amendment violation exists and position ourselves to litigate those violations.
Thanks, Yael. So, John, let's talk a bit more about these challenges that voters are facing, digging a bit deeper on what the issues that Yael raised in terms of what students and young people in general encounter when voting today. Can you talk a bit about the challenges that you found and the litigation you've brought to address those issues?
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. It was fascinating to hear Yael talk at the macro level about the challenges that students around the country are facing trying to vote, and that corresponds to exactly what we're hearing every day at the Lawyers Committee. We help to run the Election Protection Hotline, the nation's largest nonpartisan election protection hotline, 1-866-OUR-VOTE. So we, through the hotline, hear from student voters frequently about the different kinds of burdens that they're facing. And it's absolutely right that the student population is among the groups that are most deeply impacted by the increase in voter suppression measures we're seeing around the country, and particularly in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County. One kind of microcosm of that occurred just last year. And I thought it might be helpful to go through some of the situations we saw in just one state, Virginia, in their statewide election last year. Just 3 examples. First, on the campus of George Mason University in Fairfax County, the county registrar changed his policy about voter registration 2 months before a major statewide election, with publicly announcing it. And the change that he made was that students, when they registered to vote, filled out their voter registration application, for years, decades, they accepted voter registration applications when George Mason students just put their university address. And in September, right before the registration deadline, the registrar said, that's no longer good enough. In fact, you need to put your dorm name and number, ideally, room number, with your voter registration application. Otherwise, we're going to reject it. And the county didn't let students know about it at all until right before the registration deadline. And many students didn't find out until after the deadline had passed, which if we hadn't ended up bringing litigation, and we can go into that in more detail in a second, those students would have been totally left out in the cold and not eligible to vote in that important election. Similarly, in Christopher Newport University in Newport News, there was litigation the day before Election Day over one of these gerrymandering type issues or redistricting issues that Yael mentioned. There'd been ongoing litigation about Virginia's state House of Delegates districts, and a court had moved a redistricting line boundary so that it split this university into two pieces. And the registrar had tried to designate students on campus into the proper House district based on where their dorm was, whether it was in House District 94 or House District 95. But there were some students, they didn't know the dorm number, and so they had left them in their existing dorm. The day before the election, a lawsuit is filed to move those over 100 voters into a new precinct, which meant they would have to go to a new polling place. The judge signs the order, and the order says students, if they show up at the polling place they think they're supposed to go to, they're going to have to be rejected and sent to a different precinct where they can vote a provisional ballot, which may be counted. That obviously is going to depress student turnout. Another example that we saw occurred on James Madison University's campus in Harrisonburg, where over 150 students swore that they had filled out their voter registration application and submitted it to the registrar. The registrar swore that the students were not registered to vote and said that the reason they weren't eligible to vote is because they'd filled out their voter registration application on TurboVote, an online site. And according to the registrar, the students had to print out the application from TurboVote and mail it in, but TurboVote was deceptively, the layout was deceptive, and students didn't know they had to do that, and so they didn't mail in their application. So there again, you have a substantial number of students who are just left out in the cold and not able to vote in an important election. These kinds of things are happening, not just in Virginia, but all over the country in every election. It's a real problem, and I totally agree with Yael. We need to be thinking broadly, beyond these particular instances, about a broad-based response that can meaningfully address these concerns.
So, John, you mentioned that the Fairfax County Supervisor of Election changed the rules, right? 2 months before the election. And that offers, I think, a perfect opportunity to talk about Shelby County and the Voting Rights Act and what impact that would have had on the Supervisor of Elections decision had the full protections of the Voting Rights Act been in place.
Absolutely. As some of you may know, some of you may not, before the Shelby County versus Holder decision from the Supreme Court in 2013, numerous states, most of which are in the South, which include Virginia, had to submit changes for pre-clearance to the Department of Justice, or they could obtain pre-clearance from federal court in DC. They had to obtain that permission before they would implement new changes to their voting-related practices and procedures. And that tool was extremely important, both as a deterrent to efforts to engage in voter suppression measures generally, but it also, because it essentially froze election-related policies and procedures in place, helped to stop the last-second changes before elections that, whether it's voter registration purges or last-second switching of a polling place, things like that, because jurisdictions knew they had to seek permission from DOJ before they did it, and they could be taken to court if they tried to sneak under the radar. You tended not to see those changes nearly as frequently as we've been seeing them since 2013. So in this case, to take the George Mason University example, if Fairfax County Registrar had changed his mind before the Shelby County decision about his policy and decided to reject these voter registration applications, he would have had to seek pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before he did that. And if he tried to go forward without seeking pre-clearance, he would have been immediately taken to court and enjoined, and it lessens the need for protracted litigation and the reliance on legal tools that aren't as fully developed and where you don't have the same likelihood of success. And that that likelihood of success frankly impacts some of the litigation decisions that, for example, we make at the Lawyers Committee about which lawsuits can be brought and which are going to really succeed in today's legal environment.
So digging in a bit more about, now we're in the post-Shelby era where the election officials can make changes, and those have to be, when we determine that those changes violate the law, we have to bring litigation very close to the election, particularly if an action happens 2 months before the election. It's a very short window to bring litigation, and then more importantly, if that litigation is successful, get that order implemented. So can you talk a bit about the litigation you've brought close to election day and what is needed and a favorable outcome, and then what you need to do after getting that favorable outcome to get that order implemented?
That's right. Bringing these kinds of pre-election cases is kind of like whack-a-mole. We see all these problems pop up right before an election, and without Shelby County, there's too many moles to there's too many issues for one or even many civil rights organizations to hit at the same time, because it's very resource intensive. Just talking about this George Mason University case, for example, it took an organization, New Virginia Majority, came to us and said, we register voters at George Mason University campus, and we've found that our applications are the folks we're registering, their applications are getting rejected, and in some cases they hadn't even, the students themselves hadn't even heard about it. So there's a chance these changes kind of slipping under the radar and folks not finding out about it until it's too late. So then at the Lawyers Committee, we work with an organization like New Virginia Majority. We have to find impacted student voters, which again is very hard if the county isn't turning over information on an expedited basis. And Many of the students don't even know that their applications were rejected because all the county did was they sent a letter, a physical hard copy letter to the students' university mailbox, and not all of the students checked their mailbox on a daily or even weekly basis, right? So to work with the organization to find affected voters, to develop the legal theories, because as Yael mentioned, the 26th Amendment hasn't gotten a ton of traction, particularly lately. And does the 26th Amendment apply to this kind of George Mason University registration issue? That's a tricky issue and no gimme by any stretch. So ironing out your legal theories, what you think is going to fly, getting the papers together, a complaint, a preliminary injunction motion, all of that is extraordinarily labor intensive, hundreds of hours of work just for one group of students at one university. Let alone, this kind of problem is recurring in, as I said, in different counties and states and all over the country. So there's no doubt that bringing these kinds of cases is resource intensive. And as Yael said, she's 100% right. We need to engage as many members of the bar as possible to get involved, to lift up these kinds of cases, because many times we don't hear of all the cases that potential cases or problems that are happening, and then help in terms of the resource issue to make sure that we can challenge student voter suppression where it happens and achieve a good outcome, which can involve sometimes working with the county, going to the court. In the case of George Mason, we were able to achieve a settlement agreement after we went to court. So that was a great outcome for the students, and helped hundreds of students be able to register and vote in that election who wouldn't have otherwise.
And then if I can add to that a little bit, Marcia, then you also have the issue with Purcell, right? So once, at AGF, like we have, we're on 80 campuses in 25 states. We hear about these issues. Exactly what John said, the students are not necessarily being uniformly notified about rejections of their voter registration forms. What's startling to me is there's no federal mandate to notice rejections of vote by mail ballots when you can still cure them, when you're still within the cure period. You can access everything on your phone. Why are we not getting an automatic push text? Go to your Board of Elections and cure this issue, right? So we need to modernize our election system for young people and also for all voters in a range of methods. But also, once you do bring these lawsuits, right, if it's pursuant to a verified complaint, order to show cause, or for preliminary relief, just outright, then the courts are very hesitant to provide relief and change any supposed implementations of status quo systems immediately before the election, which is kind of a perversion in some ways, because these changes are happening at the last minute. The only way to resolve them is by design at the last minute, and yet a judge can very readily, and we've seen it happen, say, no, this is a little too close to the election. So it's almost like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Like we always, right? How many times in your cases, I see this all the time in our cases, that they say, oh, this issue is not moot yet. Or, this issue, you're bringing it too late. You're bringing it too late or you're bringing it too soon, right? And it's always in the inverse. It's like 0.1 or in the alternative 0.2, right? And so when we're dealing in real time, when people are not being uniformly told what their rights are, how their ballots are being treated, and the judges are hesitant to do any changes because of this kind of idea of voter confusion, then the result ends up being more disenfranchisement, essentially, because it's not really voter confusion if you're changing a rule in favor of voters, right? But there's this recalcitrance in terms of getting these wins, and we'll get them on preliminary relief when we're lucky before the election, and also because all of these issues start to boil up at the same time is really why we need to expand the base of attorneys that are trained and able to respond in the field. But then we have to go for permanent relief after the election, right? So that we don't continue to deal with these issues. And that's also very difficult. And getting the consent decrees in place so that you could just very quickly go to the same judge. You know, this lawsuit I'm talking about, I was just working on the papers this morning in with Bard College. They've had 20 years of clear, voter suppression when it comes to students in one form or another. The same thing with Texas that I was mentioning earlier, Texas A&M University, right? So the problem is that these come up every 4 years. And then we have to respond in this kind of reactionary mode due to Shelby, but also in places that were not covered by Shelby too. So we need kind of one of the measures that I know the Lawyers Committee works on, and I worked on with the Lawyers Committee when I was at Common Cause, was for restoration of the Voting Rights Act, right? And updating the preclearance formula as well, because we really need federal relief here. I've been working on a federal youth voting rights bill that can comprehensively address the youth issues specifically, but we need it across the board for all voters.
Yeah, and Yael, one of the things that John also mentioned is, the standard of review for these cases when, reject their changes to voter registration, or we're seeing disproportionate impacts, as you talked about, in terms of how the vote by mail is applied or provisional ballots. And you did mention when you were talking about your article that you have a standard of review that you've proposed. Can you briefly talk a bit more about what that is?
Yeah, so just very briefly. So just like the 14th Amendment is used as a tool against intentional discrimination and effects-based discrimination, so too should the 26th Amendment. So there's an effort to limit the application of the 26th Amendment to only look at it for prima facie intentional discrimination. And that may be very well and true and work well in a case like Florida, where we litigated to, overturn the state's ban on the allowance of early voting polling places on campuses across the state. We overlifted that ban, and only 3 months after was the 2018 election. 12 campuses aligned themselves for it. 60,000 voters took advantage of the measure. So these are statistically, these affect the election margins. They affect the election outcome. But my theory is that, we can't simply look at the relief offered by the 26th Amendment as only being able to provide relief like in the case of Florida, where, as the judge said, a banana is a banana. This is prima facie discrimination, right? That there's actually, we have to kind of expand our understanding of the 26th Amendment, because otherwise it becomes a bit perverted. Like otherwise there's added protections under a 14th Amendment jurisprudence that are not available under a 26th Amendment jurisprudence, even though the 26th Amendment was specifically ratified and calls upon the purpose of the 26th Amendment, the purpose of the Voting Rights Act. And if you read the congressional reports that were attached to the bill that the 26th Amendment text was put on, that was circulated to all the states, if you read the report that basically says, here's why you should ratify this, right, the accompanying report, that it actually explains effects-based. It explains that its purpose is to ameliorate special burdens that are affecting young voters. And it specifically says this is, in furtherance of the purpose of the 14th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act. And it talks about special burdens can include, among other things, when students must vote by absentee ballot, meaning that there are elections that are taking place when students are on break, and so that they're forced to vote by mail. Or the other specific example it says is when students have to travel to vote because their polling station is off campus. And then it says that among others. And so we have to, the Florida case and some of the other, actually almost all of the lawsuits right now around the 26th Amendment are focusing on intentional discrimination. But that's good, because we need to popularize that, the intentional discrimination is the low-hanging fruit. But I'm really nervous about that foreclosing people's understanding that actually the relief offered by the 26th Amendment is much broader than simply intentional discrimination.
Okay.
And the legislative history bears that out very clearly. And the Supreme Court history bears it out very clearly. Like Oregon v. Mitchell was litigated in 1970, and it was basically a challenge to, I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but it was a challenge to an amendment, a 1970 amendment to the Voting Rights Act. Okay. And so there, Senator Kennedy and several other senators came together and they said, let's expand access to the franchise. Let's outlaw age-based discrimination in accessing the franchise. And let's do it through congressional action as opposed to through constitutional ratification, right? So they added this 1970 amendment to the Voting Rights Act, and it was challenged. And that case was a consolidation of various cases that came together, went up to the Supreme Court. And what it found was that pursuant to the 14th Amendment, that Congress is able to expand the franchise for federal elections, but not for state elections. So it was based on the 14th Amendment, right? So then this ushered in the need for ratification of the 26th Amendment because the threat was having like a dual voter registration and voting system where young voters could participate in federal races and not state races. The reason that I raise this in terms of the standard of review is because the 14th Amendment was still upheld to be in violation there. It wasn't an abandonment of the 14th Amendment to expand the franchise to young voters. So we have to kind of push back against this. What I think is happening is that because the litigants want to play it safe for their clients, which is completely reasonable, the courts are only getting the briefs that talk about intentional discrimination and that frame the 26th Amendment as one addressing intentional discrimination. When, you know, the Supreme Court history doesn't show that, the legislative history doesn't show it, and we don't need to just play it safe in this area. Maybe for the first round of cases as we popularize and start to grapple what the amendment is, but I'm very nervous about, for example, in Florida, the judge said an emerging consensus that intentional discrimination applies. But this hasn't actually been litigated, and so we need more space really to inform the courts and inform the bar.
Thanks. John, did you have something to add there?
I was, I guess I wanted to ask a question and offer an observation. I thought your point on the intentional versus effects, based standard of review, is totally spot on. But I wonder if we're even there, and particularly in light of your discussion, for example, about absentee ballots. It made me think about the Fifth Circuit opinion that came in the Texas Democratic Party versus Abbott case. And in particular, there the Fifth Circuit said, what the 26th Amendment doesn't even apply to absentee voting. And in fact, the Supreme Court's decision in the McDonald case with the Chicago, McDonald versus Chicago, that the 26th Amendment doesn't apply, and therefore the age limit for universal access to absentee ballots isn't even something that the 26th Amendment can get at. Of course, Texas restricts universal access to absentee ballots to voters over the age of 65. So in light of what you were just saying, I guess I was curious about your response to where the Fifth Circuit went in the Abbott case, and what that counsels for litigators in our position who are thinking about do we want to bring these kinds of claims now in this environment?
Yeah, thank you for flagging that, actually, John. The Fifth Circuit, that decision is a radical decision. And I mean that, I truly mean that. It's a radical decision. What they basically found was that young voters don't have a right to access vote by mail. And the reason they decided that was premised on this McDonald decision by the Supreme Court, as you noted, that was, I think it was decided 2 years before the 26th Amendment was ratified. And so it's taking a principle out of McDonnell, which said you don't need to uniformly provide ballots for prisoners. I believe it was a categorization. And it's taking that and applying it, however decades in the future, to say that young people don't have access to uniform availability of vote-by-mail ballots. So Texas is one among 7 states that discriminates directly on account of age, that says that voters who are over 60 or 65, depending on the state, do not need to show an excuse in order to vote by mail, but all voters younger do. And COVID is not always an excuse. So that's why the situation is arising now. But the Fifth Circuit decision, actually the first one, it cited my article in a misleading way, in a way that suggests that my article says that the only purpose of the 26th Amendment was to lower the voting age. And so therefore it actually doesn't establish a right for access to the franchise free of age discrimination. First of all, that's not at all what my article, what scholarship says. I mean, there is a piece to that, but the language itself is shall not discriminate on account of age. Just like the 19th Amendment is shall not discriminate on account of sex. And that's been interpreted in various spaces to mean against men, against women, like thank you, rest in peace, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and based on gender discrimination. So the Fifth Circuit really tries to rein in on a constitutional amendment by saying that its only purpose was to lower the voting age to 18. And that's just simply not true. And I think that you raised a good point, John, is what is our responsibility as litigators when we're dealing with an evolving jurisprudence? We had the Seventh Circuit decision, independent, was not related to the 26th Amendment, but that came down over the summer. I'm sure I'll mispronounce the name, Luers. And there were some pretty radical statements there too, that regarding the attack on the right to vote. So I think that what we're finding is this extreme radical positioning of the federal bench based on recent appointees. And so we have to be very careful about the cases that we bring in terms of how they will curtail rights that have already been established. And especially in this environment, in light of the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I know that when people see this recording, it'll be in the future. So who knows what will come of it in terms of an appointment or not. But what is absolutely certain is we've seen a radicalization of the federal bench. And a result of that is this decision that came out of the Fifth Circuit, which is it's just remarkable, actually. I know I've offered a lot of words, but I'm actually speechless about it.
Yeah, no, I share your concern, I think, about both the current legal environment and what it, the sorts of cases that voting rights plaintiffs can bring and expect to be able to expand these areas of the law that haven't been fully developed heretofore, and also that frankly existing precedent is going to be applied in the same way it has in the past, and there's a concern that it can be rolled back, as we've seen from, for example, the Fifth Circuit here, the 11th Circuit, in a couple of cases that have come down in the past few months related to felon disenfranchisement, or saying that the Jingles preconditions no longer apply to Section 2 vote denial cases, and the Alabama voter ID case, to restricting standing for voting rights plaintiffs in Jacobson, the Florida ballot order case, and then also adding, for good measure, that claims that involve helping or hurting candidates of a particular party, involve non-justiciable political questions, essentially exporting the Rucho gerrymandering decision and moving it into the vote denial context that changes are afoot. And the environment we're in today is very different than it was 2 or 4 years ago. And I know we at the Lawyers Committee are hotly debating what that means in terms of the cases that we bring and the particular claims that we bring and the venue, whether we bring cases in state or federal court. So I think the need for legislation and both at the federal and state level is going to be more important than ever as we move forward, because it's possible that some of the legal tools that we used successfully, for example, in your Florida case or in our George Mason University case, may not be there in the same way that they have been in the past.
Let me interrupt for a moment with the CLE code. This is Dan Mills on behalf of the Bar CLE department. For those of you who need the CLE code, I am going to give it to you now. It is SR38. That is S as in Sam, R as in Robert, 38. The CLE code is SR38. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. So this has been a really rich discussion, and there's just so much to say, but we're winding down on time. And so one of the things I'd like to ask as we end this discussion is, in light of the challenges that young voters are facing today, particularly during the pandemic, and you briefly discussed the adverse decisions that have came out of the Fifth Circuit regarding to access to the ballot, the disparate impact of the use of vote by mail and provisional ballots, and then also general youth cynicism or disengagement with voting. What would you say one of the the messages you'd like to send forth, whether it's either around how the 16th Amendment came to be or how we need to engage in this moment and the role of the young people in the passage of the 16th Amendment? Just what words of encouragement would you give to young people today, despite these challenges in engaging in voting?
Sure. First, a couple of things. One, your vote is important, right? And voting is a habit, and there are tools available to young people who want to register and vote and have their voices heard. Many states allow, for example, registration online and even applying for absentee ballots online, which can obviously help given COVID-19. Some of the in-person, for example, voter registration drives have been impacted. So there's still time to register to vote, apply for an absentee ballot, make your voice heard. There's tools to check your registration status in most states. Online checkup tools such as a My Voter page, government websites. And so a lot of young people are engaged online, and the tools there are available to them to access and participate in elections. And if they have questions after taking a look at that, there are additional tools available. The again, Election Protection Hotline. Students and young people can call 1-86-OUR-VOTE. Simple questions. Am I registered? How do I register? Where do I go to vote? They can speak to a legal professional or a volunteer lawyer, but someone who can help answer their questions and, if necessary, loop in a county election employee to make sure that they're able to register and vote. So there are a lot of tools available to students to give them the opportunity to make their voice heard in this election cycle and beyond. And if worse comes to worse, there are plenty of attorneys who are ready and willing to step in and assist because we don't want a single young person or student to be discouraged or be disenfranchised when attempting to vote in this election.
Thanks, John. And before Yael weighs in the last 2 minutes we have, I just want to clarify the number for election protection is 866 our vote. And Yael?
I want to reiterate 1866 our vote also. You can also go to the Andrew Goodman Foundation website. We have a ton of resources for you and direct ways to access checking your voter registration status. But one of the problems when we talk about disenfranchisement is that it's disempowering. And actually there's amazing work being done right now to protect our elections. Young people are leading the movements of today, just like they were during the second Reconstruction. So the gun control movement, the climate justice movements, I mean, it's truly endless that young people are at the lead. And that's why the 26th Amendment was ratified for good reason around that point. And so I like to take Stacey Abrams' call, which is that we need to overwhelm the system. That when we see the disproportionate rejection rates of VBMs, that means we need to, first of all, be empowered by that knowledge and not disempowered by the knowledge, and also be very vigilant about, calling your county to make sure that your VBM, your vote by mail ballot has been counted. The same thing with the voter registration forms, but also to overwhelm the system. We need to vote, we need to go out, we have to stand in lines if that's the method that we want to choose, and just to be very diligent. And, people have died. Andy Goodman was died by the Klan the day that he arrived summer.
So yeah, thanks, Yael. We're at time, and I think that's, a strong message to end on. I want to thank you both for this excellent discussion and for lifting up the 26th Amendment, the challenges that young people are facing, but also how they can overcome them. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the DC Bar and the 2020 Conference Planning Committee, I'd like to thank our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present on these important topics. As a reminder, please be on the lookout for the email from the CLE staff to submit your codes for credit, as well as to complete the class evaluation. Feel free to send us an email at cle@dcbar.org if you need any help. We look forward to seeing you at future programs, and thank you.